Hey everyone, it's Kirsten. Welcome to Season 3 of the Anthropocene. The scene is set. The sun is shining and the day is warm. You take in the beautiful coastline in the distance as you bob along with the waves in a small motorboat. You check your gear one more time and fall backwards into the water, entering a different world. As you sink down, slowly the light changes from the bright yellows and oranges of the surface to the blues and greens of below. Soon, only thin streaks of light pass through the massive columns of green-brown around you. From this angle, you can truly appreciate why they call it a kelp forest. As if they were some alien tree from another world, these algal giants create a little underwater haven like no other. Small fish dart between cover, silver glinting in those few rays of sunshine, and then on the rocks below you see a variety of shapes and colors. So many sea stars. Incredible. You take one more moment to appreciate it. Your own muffled, rhythmic breathing into your mask is the only sound, save for a few calls of seabirds that barely manage to penetrate the water above you. All right, time to get back to work. You do your surveys, noting down all the creatures that call this underwater forest home. Take a few meticulous measurements and slowly surface back to the boat. A day's work done, you crawl back on board and head to shore, wondering about what all this data will be able to tell you, months, maybe even years later. Hello, my beautiful nerds. I am so excited to be here, and this might be hard to believe, but I'm super stoked about today's episode. Not like I'm ever super stoked about all of my episodes, but today's a little bit special. Now, I'm super excited because this guest is a friend of mine who's actually from my cohort in university, and it's so cool to be coming back around and sharing like the amazing science that my friends are doing. So without further ado, let me introduce PhD student Dominique Maucieri. Dominique, can you please introduce yourself to the audience?
For sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Dom, and I am a marine ecologist. I study invertebrates in the ocean, but I have a particular love of cartilaginous fishes as well. So not only invertebrates. And what fuels my research is kind of this idea of climate change, and I find it quite terrifying. And I'm very interested in how animals will react to these changes in climate, especially changes in temperature. I love to teach and share about the oceans, and I'm always very fascinated with the natural world, especially what is happening under the surface of the oceans.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That's great. So right now you're working towards your PhD, which is super exciting. And we connected specifically for this episode because your first paper came out, which is super exciting.
On the way.
It almost came out. Sorry. It almost came out, and I saw a little glimpse peek of that. So we're going to just chat about that today, which is super exciting. The paper here is titled Enduring a Major Heat Wave, the Role of Kelp Forests and Cold Refugia in Promoting Marine Invertebrate Community Resilience. So I want to start at the basics just for all of our friends that love the ocean but maybe don't know as much about the little guys. What is a marine invertebrate in general?
I'm very biased, but I think marine invertebrates are the coolest animals in the ocean. So marine is meaning that they live in the ocean. And then invertebrates are like everything without a backbone. I think they're really cool because they kind of defy these laws that we've set up for vertebrates, and they're not bound to any of them. So some of them have skeletons that are made of water. Some of them don't have centralized nervous systems like brains. Some can't even move once they kind of plant themselves onto the ground. They're stuck there. Some can push their stomachs out of their mouths and digest food outside of their body and then slurp it all up. Some poop out their mouth. They just do whatever that they want to do. The body plan of an invertebrate is so broad, but they are all still animals. And I think that they're super fascinating because some are less mobile, some are more mobile, some are more sensitive to heat, some are less sensitive to heat, and they're this crucial part of our food webs. So they are feeding so many parts of the marine food webs. Fish are eating them. When they die, their little bodies are feeding the detritivores. They're all over the place. I love them. And I just don't think they get the recognition that they deserve.
Right. That is so awesome. The regurgitating stomach thing is like mostly starfish, right? And some other things.
Yeah.
That is one of my favorite things because people are either really interested or completely horrified. And especially because starfish are like this adorable little, it's a star. And it's like, did you know how they eat?
And sea cucumbers are wild too. They can eviscerate, so like they can like throw up their stomach and just like leave it there and some of their guts as like a an offering of please eat this stomach. I'm gonna run away now. And then they'll just regrow their stomach and their intestines and things. Like we can't do that. That's pretty wild.
Right. That's crazy. It's like, so I know you want me as a snack, but how about you have this snack that I already consumed from earlier instead? And the fish is kind of like, okay, sure. Easy meal.
You can run away now.
That's crazy. That's so wild. Yeah. So invertebrates, completely underrated. And we will keep talking about how awesome they are as we keep going. But yeah, we're also going to talk about how they are related to kelp, and kelp forests, because that's kind of what the paper was. So what is a kelp? How do they do? What do they look like?
Kelps are very cool as well. They aren't plants. Some people think that they are plants. They are not. They're like plants and they can have a lot of similar kind of structures as plants, but they are like taxonomically very distinct. And they're actually not one distinct lineage, they're multiple. So, like the macroalgae, the like large seaweeds, they come from three very distinct lineages, and we just kind of group them all together. But they don't have a common ancestor, which is super wild. They just kind of all evolved very similarly, three different ways. Very cool. So yeah, like I said, they have similar structures to plants. So with a plant, we have like a root system. With seaweeds, we have this holdfast. So it's like kind of this. It looks like roots, but it's like gluing them to a rock or a shell or something like on the benthos. And then like the leaves of a plant, we have blades on our kelps or on our different seaweeds, and they are, they look like a big leaf. They are where photosynthesis can occur. They still photosynthesize, and they're also where they kind of reproduce. They'll produce spores on their blades. And then like the stem of a plant or the trunk of a plant, we have the stipe of a seaweed. So it's kind of like its trunk, and so it has those three main parts: holdfast, stipe, and then the blades. And then some also have nematocysts, which are like little gas-filled little sac things that are like attached up by the blades, and it helps to keep those blades up and floating so that they can photosynthesize. So instead of like being as structurally strong as plants are, where they just, defy gravity and stay upright, they use like little air bladders to like help float them to the surface so that they can get the sunlight. And yeah, kelps are a type of seaweed. They're a type of a brown seaweed, but they're structurally a little bit different. They have like more carotenoids, and they're like a taxonomic grouping. They're typically pretty like tough, like more like woody. They aren't made of wood, but like they have stronger stipes, and usually are quite a lot larger. And you'll see them usually more subtidal. You can see them kind of low intertidal, but they're not the ones you're going to see like at the top of a beach or anything. They'll be like quite deep in the water. Yeah.
Wow, that's so cool. So it's a very like planty non-plant for sure. There's a lot of like similarities going on there. That's so cool. I didn't know about the air sacs. They just have like a bunch of little balloons essentially kind of just like keeping them upright in the water.
Yeah, some will have like 100 of them kind of like down their stipe to hold them up. And some like the bull kelp, Nereocystis, it'll just have one massive one that just like floats to the top, and then all the blades come off it, kind of looking like hair almost. It looks like a little person, kind of little head. Yeah.
Okay, that is super neat. So kelp are obviously very cool, but how are they important then to marine communities in a general sense, like marine animal communities, and I guess like plant or other like algal communities as well?
So we consider kelps to be ecosystem engineers, and that's just like this big fancy word that means that they are going to change the environment that they're in to support other organisms. So kelp specifically can like dampen waves and change currents. They can provide food and shelter to organisms. Obviously, they're like these huge, almost tree-like things,
Hmm.
and so they can alter the amount of light that reaches the benthos and also the sedimentation that occurs. So yeah, they're like really changing what the ocean looks like within these like dense kind of kelp forests. So yeah, they're engineering this new environment.
Right, cool. Yeah. So there's a lot of similarities then if you look, and that's why it's a kelp forest between like trees on land that buffer wind and like reduce the amount of light that gets down to the forest floor. And I would imagine a little bit of like how different spores and stuff circulate too, like within these ecosystems.
Yeah, they change the currents, so things are, gonna move more or less through those areas depending on how the kelp are there. But yeah, very much like a forest on land.
Very cool. Kelp be kelping very well.
Yeah.
That's amazing. All right. So then we have our marine invertebrates. We have these kelp forests. So we want to kind of look at the intersection of how these kelp forests can promote this word resilience that we're going to look into. So what does resilience mean then in terms of talking about marine invertebrates, and why is this important?
So resilience is part of this idea of how an ecosystem is going to respond to stressors. So stressors are anything that, is stressful to a community. So it can be something like a heat wave where the temperature is going to increase above what it's usually at for that area. And so it's like a stressful heat event. Other stressors could be, changes in the pH, changes in storms, those kinds of things. So
Mm-hmm.
anything that's stressful, the idea with resilience is, like how the community is going to respond to that, or the ecosystem will respond to that. So we kind of break it into two parts, and you can look in the resilience as you can look at resilience as like the resistance or the recovery. So with resistance, it might be a community that won't change as much when it experiences a stressor compared to other communities.
Mm-hmm.
Or if we look at the recovery aspect, it could be one that when it experiences a stressor, it's able to recover faster. So either, resist change or recover quicker from change. And those would be more resilient communities. For my work, I look more at the resistance
Mm-hmm.
just because I don't have as much data after to see how long they're recovering or to even like compare between. But it's a lot easier to detect when that event occurs if we're changing or if we're not changing. So I kind of look at the resistance aspect of resilience.
Cool. All right. Yeah. So, like, for example, if a heat wave is coming in, the resistance is, a bunch of this community could possibly die from this heat wave. But if they're resilient in a resistance standpoint, they don't die. And then if it's a recovery, a bunch of them die off, but they have enough left and they do okay, like reproducing quick enough to kind of rebuild that community.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
also moving in and out of an area.
Yeah.
So the sessile ones will probably just die, like the ones that can't move,
Mm-hmm.
that are stuck there. They probably will just die if we don't see them again. But sometimes we don't really know what happens to organisms if they're just like moving deeper, or if they're moving out of the area, or if they're dying.
Mm-hmm.
So that is a little bit of like a question mark in our studies. When do we consider something like moving out of an area or having died from this? But either way, we're like losing that diversity in the area during the events.
Okay. Very cool. Lots to discover still. Lots that's being discovered. So let's tie this together to look at a little bit of this specific work that you've done. What did your team hypothesize then in terms of these kelp forests and marine invertebrate resilience?
So initially, what we were kind of thinking would happen or hypothesizing is that areas that like had more kelp, or especially ones with lower temperatures, so these like cooler than the surrounding area kind of little spots, that they would be able to like support the communities with this increased resilience.
Mm-hmm.
So more kelp, cooler temperatures, that those communities would change less with these big marine heat waves that were coming through.
Right.
And that idea is that they are providing this refuge and maybe like able to support and kind of maintain the diversity that then could move out and like reseed the area after, like go and kind of move into new areas, but kind of preserve the biodiversity in these cooler or more kelpy areas.
Okay, right. Very cool. So yeah, just a little kind of cold spot where no matter if this heat wave comes through, it's like deterred a little bit by the kelp forest, and it would look better than the outside that doesn't have a kelp forest. All right. And what did we find out after the study?
Okay, so this study, it takes place like a movie. It is taking place in the Channel Islands National Park. So this is like off the coast of Southern California. And this data set has been collected for about 40 years, and I looked at 25 years of it. So I have a really nice long time series. The divers have been collecting this data yearly for that entire time, did an amazing job. And collected so much information about which invertebrates were there and weren't. So we were looking at 30 different invertebrate species, and all of them have associations with kelp. So they're all species that are known to associate in kelp forests. And I had, I think, 16 different sites over this 25-year time span from 1995 to 2019. Mm-hmm. And in that time frame, there were 2 marine heat wave events. We had the 1997 to 1998 El Nino event, and then the 2014 to 2016 blob event. So both of those, the temperature in the ocean got really warm, especially that blob event. The blob was very hot and lasted quite a long time. It was a very drastic marine heat wave. And yeah, we wanted to look at these 16 sites across the Channel Islands and how the invertebrates responded. The Channel Islands is also interesting because it's at the center of like this cross of 2 currents. So we have the California current, which comes from the north, kind of down south, and it brings really cold water. So some of the sites have this like cool current just bringing in really cold water. So they're very cool sites. And then we have the the California countercurrent, which brings this warm water from like the tropics up towards, the north. And so there's these other sites that are just getting this really warm water. And in this like very like geographically small area, we have a huge gradient of temperatures. Mm-hmm. And that's why we picked this site to look at this question of if these like colder, kelpier sites were maybe helping. And yeah, in reality, it's very complex, as is most community ecology. Mm-hmm. So the first thing we wanted to do was just establish a relationship between kelps and invertebrate density and diversity. So if the kelps were supporting the invertebrate communities. And interestingly, we found that there was no difference in the number of species based on how much kelp there was, but the evenness did change, which does make sense. And I'll break it down. So these are all species that are known to associate with kelps. They're kelp species, like kelp-related species. So when we have, communities with less kelp and communities with more kelp, we still see the same number of individual species. But when we have more kelp, we're able to support like higher abundances of those species. So we see more even communities, which just means we don't have like one dominant species and a bunch of rare species. We have like a lot more even abundances between all our species. So the kelp forests are supporting, more abundant, even communities. But not the number of species differing, which I thought was quite cool, but also makes sense.
Yeah.
So then I wanted to look at on this like time series, how, communities were changing, this like resistance idea. And I wanted to look at it using like change points. So like inflection points or tipping points within our species. So they could be, going along at a constant density, and then, the blob event occurs and they just drop and they like really drastically change in their density. And so I was looking for those like little change points, the tipping points where, they were, going along at a certain density and then they drastically switch. Mm-hmm. They could switch more or less, but I was looking for those like little switch points, little change points. And so I kind of analyzed this entire time series, all the different species, all the different sites. And I found that there is this like huge amount of change points that were occurring right at the start of the blob event. So the community was fairly stable over time until the blob started. And then there's this massive like state shift that was occurring, which was very cool. If I kind of had looked at these with some more linear kind of modeling methods, I might have like missed how drastic the switch in the community was, because I was looking for these like change points it was just, yeah, the like 3 years kind of right around the start of that heat wave was where the community was just very much changing. So to kind of like pull that apart a little bit more, I took those 3 years and I figured out, what the trends were. How were the species changing? Like, were they increasing or were they decreasing when they had that change point? And then also how this sites kind of like stacked up with each other. Initially, it kind of appeared that there might be some resistance, which I was pretty excited about. So sites that were a little bit cooler were showing more change points and also positive change. So the species were increasing.
Right.
Whereas more warm sites, they were seeing less change occurring and also more negative change. So more like species loss in densities.
Yeah.
So initially that was like, okay, maybe these sites are able to support the like resistance of these communities, or more than that, like support them in their increasing in density. So like be like beneficial. So I was kind of excited about that. So then my next step was to look at, we call it like the winners and the losers, which is sounds a little bit mean. But it's like the idea of like some species are going to win and some are going to lose in any situation. So we wanted to see who was winning in these sites that were, maybe supporting resilience, and who was losing, to really kind of piece apart if the community is benefiting on as a whole or if only certain species were benefiting. And that's kind of what we found, that only some species were benefiting. So some species were in these, in the Channel Islands, they were kind of in these warmer sites. And then when the heat wave occurred, they were able to increase their density and move into the cooler areas. They were more warm water affinity species. They liked it a little bit warmer. And so when the cooler sites warmed up just a little bit, even if they were cooler still than the surrounding areas, they were now, a good area that they could move into.
Right.
And those species were a lot of our urchin species, which are not the most beneficial, especially for a kelp forest, because they will come through and they will eat all of those holdfasts and stipes, and then the blades will just disappear from the kelp. They'll get drifted off out to sea, and they can, like a lawnmower, just mow down a kelp forest in very little time. So what we found was actually that the heat wave was allowing these cooler sites to become more beneficial to these warm water urchin species, and not the other species that were more vulnerable. And we wanted to hopefully find an area that would be protecting them. So yeah, not ideal. And then in the area, our loser species, most of them were our sea stars. So during the blob event, there was an outbreak of sea star wasting disease, which is kind of what it sounds like. Sea stars, and they waste away. They kind of like their tissue becomes all white and necrosis-y, and it like falls off. It's pretty gnarly looking when you see photos of it. And that's what happened to a lot of our sea cucumbers or our sea stars. We have one sea cucumber in the area that we were looking at as well, but it's heavily fished. There's like an active fisheries. So that one was also a loser species because not only was there a heat wave, but it was still being fished. And so kind of both of those stressors were probably a little too much. And so it saw these large declines over the time as well. So yeah, essentially what we found was that overall, there were not these areas, like cooler areas or kelpie areas, that were providing resistance to the whole invertebrate community. It was actually benefiting like the sea urchin communities, which is not very beneficial. If from like a management perspective, we don't typically want to try to find areas to protect sea urchins. We're usually trying to find areas to protect everything other than the sea urchins. And yeah, also just kind of how much nonlinear change there was in the system. So how many change points were very clustered at that blob event. So just how kind of extreme the blob event was for these invertebrates. And yeah, just like stressing why we need to look at who is being affected and not just how the community is responding, because initially it did kind of appear like, oh, maybe we have some resilience happening here. This is exciting. But then it was, oh, no. The resilience is the sea urchins having a great time. So yeah, that's kind of what we found.
Yeah, I think that speaks so much importance to, like, obviously in ecology, there's a lot of layers to look at. And this is kind of just like, don't just read the headline like thing, because you could just be like, oh, like, when the heat wave comes, like, organisms still thrive. And that's true. But like, which organisms are thriving? And is that causing even more like of a positive feedback loop in a bad way? Because like you're saying, these urchins are moving into these kelp forests that are, maybe not the cold refugia in the way that we want, but really important to these ecosystems. And then they're getting rid of those. And then there's just like nowhere left for these communities to bounce back afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. If there's no kelp forest, a lot of these species don't want to be there anyway.
Right. Yeah, that's tough. It's always hard, I think, a lot of times as scientists when we kind of get the opposite of what we were kind of, I know you shouldn't say hoping for, because you hypothesize something, based on the science, and not just you're like, I hope that this is what it looks like. But a lot of times it ends up not being the case. But why is this so important then for you to figure out, okay, like these aren't actually providing refugia? Like why is that important?
Yeah. So there's been some kind of ideas in the like marine protected area management kind of conversations that we should be, finding these temperature refugia and protecting them, like making them into MPAs and, trying to make sure that we as humans aren't destroying the areas. So then they're nice and pristine and hopefully will act as this refuge for species. And so things like this like piece of literature will just go to support the other literature that already exists, that we need to kind of have this very diverse portfolio of areas that we're protecting.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to find many different criteria to protect, because if we put, all our eggs in this basket, we're going to really just be protecting beautiful sea urchin area. Whereas if we're looking for cold areas that maybe are also all these other criteria, like, very large or old MPAs will protect more than, small new MPAs.
Mm-hmm.
So there's lots of criteria that we have and we know is beneficial. So we kind of bring all of it together. We can pick areas to protect that will have a better outlook for our species, and not just kind of go based on an assumption that cooler is better.
Mm-hmm. Right. It's about keeping it diverse and, like you said, large areas. It's kind of like the whole just like planting trees will save everything. Actually, it won't. Like you have to plant trees and you have to protect wetlands and you have to like do that thing. So it applies to the ocean as well. Like like underwater grasslands and the kelp forest and all of it is like actually the key to the long-term solution.
Yeah.
Very cool. I do want to point out 25 years of data is like a lot, and it makes you like the perfect millennial job hunter because you're under 30 with 25 years of experience.
Yeah, it was so cool to work with this data set. Like 25 years is such a long data set. And for the most part, I only used 25 years because they kind of switched up their methodology in 1995. Okay.
Right.
So there was 40 years, but there was a bunch of different methodologies and they were still kind of establishing sites. So like 25 years of like the same methodology yearly in the same sites, like no sites were missed in the years. Like they went to every site in these years. That's an incredible feat. So it was a really cool data set to work with.
Yeah, this is really amazing. Because especially, in the day and age of like, you gotta, publish and hot science and publish more papers now. Like we have to remember the importance of these like slow, long-term data sets that don't, necessarily produce like these crazy results right away, but you have to monitor things over long term or it doesn't make a lot of it doesn't make any sense, especially on the scale of like community ecology and stuff. So that's so cool that you got to work with that. Yeah.
Yeah, if we don't know like what our baseline is, we don't know how to quantify how things are changing. So these long-term data sets are absolutely crucial for just giving us an insight into what that baseline could have been. I mean, there's still, that's the baseline in 1995, but it's better than no baseline.
Yeah. Yeah, that's incredible. So you also looked a little bit at like which species were the most important in how communities changed. What did that kind of tell you?
Mainly that was telling us that the like sea urchins were the ones that were driving a lot of this change. When I redid a bunch of analyses just with like removing the sea urchins,
Mm-hmm.
just to see if I didn't have sea urchins in this data, would I still detect what I detect?
Mm-hmm.
And the answer was no. The
Wow.
sea urchins were the things that were driving the associations with temperature. And yeah, it was these sea urchins that were the driving species. The sea stars were kind of driving it on the like sad end of things as well. There's one sea star species, the sunflower star, Pycnopodia, and it has not even been seen in the Channel Islands since 2014.
Oh, okay.
It is not in the area anymore. It still is, it exists. We have it kind of up here, Vancouver Island. Its populations are kind of recovering, but yet to return to the Channel Islands. So losses of species like that are also driving things. The sunflower star is a major predator. Like these sunflower stars can be like a meter wide,
Wow.
which is 3 feet for our American friends. And that's like a massive sea star on the bottom of the ocean that would be, eating things like sea urchins, and keeping the sea urchins a little bit in check. So yeah, we kind of have these interactions between species that are important, but the urchins are really driving a lot of this like temperature related change.
Okay, that's incredible. So not to get like too hard into the complicated stuff, but what did some of the analysis look like for you, for the people that are intrigued by that?
So stats is like my favorite part. I love stats.
Okay.
So keeping this, not too complicated will be tough because I want to tell you all of the specifics. But obviously this was not a data collection that I was like doing for 25 years.
Yeah.
So it was a much more like stats and analysis focused project. And because it spans so many years, I mean, the data is very clean in terms of like what a data set looks like, but even still with this time scale, there were so many like data manipulation challenges and things that needed to be accounted for. So that on its own was like a huge feat, was just like wrangling the data and getting it and understanding what it kind of looked like and how it like would act.
Right.
But for the change points, this was done with a package in R, called like the environmental change point package. And it allowed me to detect in these time series for each species, if there was a change in the average of the density or the trend of the density. So it was kind of like doing both, which was really cool. So that was like some packages that helped me do that. And then I did a bunch of binomial tests to determine, if what I saw as change points were different from like a null model that I made of just random change points.
Right.
Because I also wanted to know just like how many of these change points are just due to chance. Like you could just have a species drastically change randomly. So I had to produce a null model of just what it would kind of look like randomly if change was occurring randomly, and then see what my changes look like compared to that. So kind of to test between them, I use these binomial tests. And then I used a bunch of different models to look at how factors like kelp cover and temperature were changing with the change points.
Right.
And so I used GAMs, so generalized additive models, which allowed me to not assume a linear relationship between them, but to we kind of say it has like a wiggly relationship.
Okay.
So it lets it wiggle a little bit. It lets it not be linear. So maybe it could saturate or kind of have that like exponential increase or like a sigmoidal S shape. It just like allows the relationship to not be a straight line. So that's why I used generalized additive models. Yeah, that's kind of what the analysis looked like. It took 2.5 years to do all of this analysis. I mean, it wasn't the only thing I worked on every day, 9 to 5 kind of thing. But it was something that I've been working at, picking at, and analyzing for like 2.5 years at this point. We're coming up on 3 years. And I think, the last like couple months have just been the writing and kind of packaging it all together. So it is very complex and a lot of analyses and so many figures.
Yeah, like
that I've made
a kind
over the years.
warning to those who, want to be marine biologists. It is incredible and it's so amazing to be a biologist, but there's a lot of behind the computer work and stuff as well, which can be absolutely fascinating. I mean, stats and making models and doing this stuff can be interesting too. But, if you think you're going to be out on a boat every single day, like just have a little reality check and then still pursue your dreams, but be ready for that.
And like, sure, there are definitely jobs where you can be that person that's
Right.
like on the boat every day in, day out. But I think you do miss the like, what is happening with this data? Like, what are we finding part of it? Which then drives people to like go into more of the research side of it as well, like collect the data and analyze it. And then you're stuck with, lots of data analysis, which I think is super fun.
Right.
And I really enjoy it. So you just have to convince yourself it's really fun, and then you'll enjoy the data analysis part too.
I love that. So have you got to go into the field at all for any of your projects? And I don't know if you want to share a little bit of that with us.
Yeah. So for this project, this was like a collaboration with my collaborator on this project, other than my supervisor, Amanda Bates, is David Kushner, who has been working with the National Park Service monitoring the Channel Islands for more than 3 decades. He like collected this data like the entire time,
Wow.
which is great. And it's been so nice having him to like talk to someone who like was there and collected the data when you're doing these big analyses, because it's hard to kind of know what to look for and what to do with the data if you didn't help collect it.
Yeah.
So for this work, this has been collected with like the National Park Service Kelp Monitoring Program, not me. But I do go into the field as kind of other parts of my life. I love teaching. So the past 2 summers I've spent out at Banfield Marine Sciences Center teaching a marine ecology field course. I was the TA, and I actually worked with one of our friends, Sarah Smith.
Yeah.
She was the professor for the course, which is so funny. We're all in the same circles.
Yeah.
So she was the professor, I was the TA, and yeah, we spent many days out in the field teaching students about marine ecology. That was like a 3rd, 4th, 5th year undergraduate course. And then I also do have one of the chapters in my PhD is a physiology chapter. So it's going to be some different physiology experiments. So I've done some field work and some like lab experiments, kind of setting that up. And then hopefully in the next few months, I will run for real all of those experiments. And they'll be looking at sea stars and how factors like temperature are affecting them. So it'll be a bunch of sea stars in different water conditions and tracking how they go over this little, physiology experiment.
Great.
But for the most part, I am a big data girly. So I do spend a lot of time doing data analyses and working with long-term data sets. But I do go out into the field sometimes.
That's awesome. It's a little bit of everything though. You're kind of you get in the lab, you get in the field, you get in the teaching, you're doing the data.
Yeah. And it's more fun to go into the field for teaching than it is for research, because it's way less stress.
Yeah.
And you get to have more fun and be more curious.
Right.
When you go to collect data and you're like, I just need to find one more sea star, like I need 40 sea stars, we need to find one more, that's stressful.
Right.
But when you're just like, let's see what we find, shout when you find something cool and I'll come over and we'll discuss it. Way more fun.
Yeah.
So I love teaching in the field for sure.
Not to put you on the spot, but do you have like any cool anecdotes or something like a beautiful field moment or a fail field moment you wanna share? That can be fun sometimes.
Okay, this year, our first day into the field. So Banfield Marine Science Center is located on like the west side of Vancouver Island. If you know where like Tofino is, you kind of take a very short little boat trip south and you could be in Banfield. It's quite remote. It started as a fishing community, but there is this Marine Science Center that's stationed there, and they do field courses. So for our first field day in this course this summer, we went out to this little islet called Wizard Islet, and it's like really small. It's just like a lump of rocks. And it was our first day out with all of our students. And on the way there, we had a little sea otter that came and said hello. There was a ton of seals that were bopping around and watching us. And then as we were kind of doing these transects, there was just whales that were just giving us like a little show. And me and Sarah, the like professor, we were just like, yeah, you're not going to get another day like this. Like this was like the bar set way too
Yeah.
high. You saw all of the charismatic like megafauna here, and everything else is going to be less impressive. So really enjoy this because we very rarely see all of these animals at the same time accidentally. So that was a really fun day.
Yeah, that's amazing. I remember I also went to Bamfield. If anybody's listening to this who is a student and you have any kind of opportunity to go out there, do it. I did a 6-week course and it's just like this little sliver of heaven, and you learn a lot as well. Like it's not just like out there running around. You also will be very tired and pushed, but it's so good. But yeah, I saw like a humpback like super far in the distance one day. So that is good vibes. It must be the good vibes from you and Sarah because you guys are both lovely humans. All right, so we'll pop like back a little bit more to the project again and kind of get into, or don't want to call it a buzzword necessarily, but climate change. So your project, was it necessarily based under the context of climate change, or were you just looking at heat waves like in general?
Yeah, I do think that it is under the umbrella of like climate change. My work focuses very much on like using these like natural experiments to see how communities will change. So I did mention like I'm going to do some like in lab physiology experiments, but for the main like part of my thesis, I really look at these already existing data sets that have just by happenstance experienced these really extreme events, to kind of get that natural what communities are actually doing in the real world. Because even with our experiments, you can't truly mimic nature completely. So I use that as just a way to inform how we think future events are going to continue to affect our communities, because with things like marine heat waves, our prediction is that they're only going to become more frequent, more intense, and longer lasting. So the more we know now on how our like communities are currently responding, it'll help us to predict what will happen when we get more, when they're hotter, when they last longer, and inform how, we might do management, how we, might restrict areas or different ways that we might, or areas that we might focus on for some of these, bringing coral back to areas or replanting corals, or like all these different kind of things that we're looking at as ways to tackle climate change, maybe areas that we want to focus on or events we want to focus on, by knowing what the communities might do to help inform all of those decisions. So I do think it is under the context of climate change. And yeah, just like really focusing on what has already happened to inform our future.
Right. Just being proactive in management strategies and understanding what might happen so that we can try, our best to mitigate those challenges as they come. Excellent. Yeah, very interesting. Totally. So I do have a Patreon question from a patron, Sabrina Moore, S'more Bugs. So she was just curious if you have to communicate to the public about climate change. Do you have any suggestions on the best way to talk about the topic of climate change, or have you had any interactions communicating about it? And kind of just what is your opinion on the best way to go about talking about climate change and biodiversity loss, which can be quite a struggle sometimes.
So with like grad school specifically, there's no like, unless you have like a partnership with an organization and they require something of you, there's no like quota of like communicating to the public that you have to do for any kind of degree. But I do kind of believe in the saying of like science is not science until it's communicated, which does come into like producing papers and that kind of thing. But I really try to do outreach and also talk with people about my research. A lot of my outreach focuses on the oceans in general and trying to get people to just love the oceans and think that they are beautiful, because you don't want to save something that you don't like. Like people aren't going to want to invest time and effort into something that they think is scary and they don't know what's even there and it's not very cool. So a lot of my outreach does just focus on let's talk about the weird and wonky little critters that are in the ocean and how beautiful they are, how amazing they are. And inevitably, all of those conversations end up going kind of to climate change. So with like my work, I'm not focused necessarily, kind of like we talked on like the specifics of climate change and like how bad it is or isn't, that kind of thing. It's more like how we are currently responding.
Mm-hmm.
I do find though, if we only talk about the negatives, that everyone kind of leaves with this like doom and gloom perspective, and like there's no reason to try because there's no use.
Right.
So I always try to sprinkle in little bits of hope, little like positives, um, little things like that we've found that are helping, or little areas that are doing well,
Mm-hmm.
or like these little beneficial things that are occurring. So people leave the conversation with that idea of hope or with actions that they can do. So like when I'm talking with school kids, we always talk about, trying to make sure that we are doing, recycling, we are turning off lights, like just starting to get an idea of like little actions we can do to be a little bit more environmentally friendly. Because then you kind of keep building off of that and making larger steps. Like, oh, when we see trash on our beaches, we're going to pick it up and make sure that it like stays out of the waters. And sure, that's like so minuscule and
Mm-hmm.
like not a lot. But then once you start with the little steps, the bigger steps kind of slowly become manageable. If we just ask people to right off the bat lobby for, systemic change, that's like a huge ask. But if we're slowly, especially at young ages, just being aware and caring about the environment, we can have more, positive and beneficial conversations as we keep going. So yeah, that's one thing I like to do, especially is like little bits of hope and little actionable things that people can do.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I love that. That's really important. We do need to understand that there's issues and that action needs to be taken. But like you said, there tends to be so much negativity. And if it feels like there's absolutely no hope, then what is the reason to even do anything? So in the show notes this time, other than Dominique's lovely pages that you can follow her, I will also go ahead. There's various pages that I follow that also do like happy, like environmental news. So I'll link a couple of those too, because it's good to just like keep a little bit of that hope in there, as well as, actionable change. Like what can you do without overwhelming yourself either? Yeah. Great.
Mm-hmm.
So cool. So we'll do a little bit of kind of a negative and then spin it into a positive. But what are some of the biggest threats then to our invertebrate friends in the ocean right now? And then we'll talk a little bit about what's looking good and what we can do to help that.
So I think the top two researched like stressors for oceans are temperature and pH.
Mm-hmm.
And I think both of those are going to have extremely drastic consequences to our little invertebrates, our little watery friends.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you kind of think about temperature on like land versus in the water, like if you go outside on a hot day and you're like, oh, it's like quite hot, it's a hot day. But if you go into a hot tub, it feels even hotter, even if the temperature outside is the same temperature as a hot tub,
Mm-hmm.
because of water and just its ability to hold heat, its like thermal capacity, you will feel that heat a lot more. So all of the little invertebrates and fish under in the ocean, they can't escape the heat. It's there. It is touching their body all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in air, we can find, shade and these pockets of like cooler, like little bit nicer. But it's a lot harder in the ocean because of that thermal capacity of water. And then pH as well, for a lot of our different organisms that are producing calcified shells and things, the acidity of the water really affects the ability for them to produce new shells, like the calcium carbonate, in order to pull that out of the ocean and use it to make a shell is very dependent on the pH of the water. So when the
Mm-hmm.
pH changes, it's slowly becoming more acidic. That is going to really affect the ability for things like corals to calcify, for anything with a shell to produce that shell. And yeah, I think those two, especially because they can't be avoided
Mm-hmm.
when they're changing. It's not like, if humans are really messing up this area over here, over there, maybe it's okay.
Right.
If the ocean is getting hotter and the ocean's getting more acidic, like there's no escape. So I do think that those are kind of sadly are two big scary things.
Okay. And do you know some of the like large scale, small scale solutions that are even just being worked on, experimented on for helping mitigate these problems?
So there are like lots of mitigation things looking at, like with corals, how we can help to recover and fragment them and kind of increase coral reefs. But for like those two main stressors, like heat and pH, that really comes down to like the overarching issue of just climate change and global warming in general. Both of those are being driven by the, global temperature and the amount of carbon dioxide that is being emitted. So for those, like, that comes back to all of our classic like ways to reduce emissions and slow the increase of our global temperature rise, which we can do little bits as our individuals, but again, like that is something that is going to require huge systemic change. And so for that, like some of our best solutions are things like lobbying, and trying to get some policy in place to hit those emission kind of reduction targets, and not overshoot them. The more we can keep it kind of like on the lower end of emissions, like the lower we can keep it, the less change we will see in our oceans. And that's what's determining it, is how much we can reduce our emissions will be how, better off the oceans will end up being.
Right. Thank you so much. That's amazing.
Doom and gloom.
So I always ask like a little bit of a silly question to wrap up, and this is maybe a mean one. What is the best marine invertebrate and why?
Oh no. There are so many. I mean, I am a huge lover of nudibranchs.
Right.
They are sea slugs. And they are beautiful. Like they come in so many different colors and shapes. They're all over the place. There's one we have here on the West Coast. It's called like the hooded nudibranch. It's got this big, like, it looks like a huge cloak hood essentially, but that's its like mouth. And it smells like watermelons if you pulled it out of the water. It like smells like watermelons. Yeah. It's so wild. It is pelagic, so it like swims around. And it uses this big kind of hood to scoop things out of the water. It is so cool. I think nudibranchs are very cool. Ranking all the invertebrates is hard. I don't know if they're necessarily the most cool, but I think that the fact that one smells like watermelon is pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, that's always a horrible question that makes you like betray all your little friends. But nudibranchs are so wild, and if anybody's listening and has never seen a nudibranch, like you're about to go down the Google Images rabbit hole of your life, because, like you said, so many shapes and sizes. Some of them like have these little like lung structures that look like little fluffy bunny tails, or gill structures, I should say. Sorry, there's everything and anything, and I didn't know, apparently one that smells like watermelon, which is absolutely mind-blowing to me. That is so cool. Great. Well, awesome, Dom. We talked a little bit already, kind of like what's coming next from you. So that's super exciting. Maybe we'll have you back on here someday. But is there anything else that I didn't mention you'd like to end us off with here?
I mean, I would love to end on just a shout out. I want to just shout out like that Kelp Forest monitoring program and all others who are collecting long-term data sets, because how important that data is, and it's only going to become more important, looking at how trends are changing, how these things like temperature and pH and extreme climatic events are affecting things, like how all those scary things are going to affect our oceans. So if you have the ability to support a long-term data set in any way, whether it's like helping to collect it or donating to these organizations that are collecting it, I would recommend it, because they are having that baseline, and having that how things are changing is only going to become more important. So yeah, shout out to those long-term data sets, because they are key.
That's great. Yeah, we will maybe throw down a couple links as well. It's going to be Link City in the show notes today. But you guys are going to enjoy it. We'll throw some links down there where people can go even just check them out, see what they can do to donate or get involved, maybe if they're located in some of those communities. Also, we're ocean themed. If y'all didn't listen to the episode just before this, when we did with Joshua Sandin Miller with Sounds of the Ocean. So if you want to feel inspired a little bit as well about the beauty of the ocean, that's there. I feel like I need to go to the beach now because I've just been talking ocean all week. It's been amazing. Yeah. And thank you so much, Dom. It was really fun just to meet up with you because we haven't had a virtual coffee either in forever, and see all these amazing things you're doing with science and with people. And yeah, thank you for taking the time to hang out with me today.
Thank you for having me. This was so much fun.
Great. Anyway, just going to wrap up. Everyone, thanks for getting to here to the end. As always, big shout out to my couple patrons that are helping this show keep going. I got Rob Nelson, Sabrina Moore, and Jack Glass. It means a lot to me that you guys are here. And of course, to Garrett, my beautiful sound wizard, who just helps make this show sound so much better. And I don't know what I'd do without you. So thanks, everybody. And we'll see you next time. Hey, thanks for sticking around to the end of the episode. Hope you enjoyed it. Make sure you head to the show notes, check out the links of things I might have mentioned in the show, go follow us on social media, and yes, do @ me. I'd love to hear from you, what you think, if you want to be a guest with me, if you have suggestions for future episodes, that would be great. Other than that, we do have a Patreon link as well below if you're feeling like helping support the show, and I can't wait to see you around for next episode. Thanks, bye.